that kind of stuff was kind of an early sign that I look back on and I'm like, oh, okay, I see why people cared and I didn't. This is my very first video I'm recording, but I think I've changed my mind about posting it first. I'm going back to like when I was, 10 years old. I mean, I remember in the year 1998, kids starting to whisper about sex, the word, and around age 10 is when the start of this story will be for me. So that's the year 2000. And that context matters a little bit because, knowledge of asexuality was a lot different back then than it is right now for 10-year-olds. And by the way, also I'm a sex-averse asexual. So that's going to affect what I count as my asexuality and what being asexual is like for me. Also, I'm on the aromantic spectrum. So all of these things affect, the context of the personal stories I'll be telling you about the signs that I was asexual. When I was sitting in the waiting room for a haircut, I was like 10 years old, I was in 5th grade, and my mom asked me if I had a crush on anyone. I thought I did maybe have a crush on a boy, or I thought about it, and I kind of like picked someone who it seemed like maybe I had a crush on him. Because I wanted to get to know him better, I felt like we had some things in common. We seemed to have like similar interests in books, and in general, it was kind of more like a squish. It was like wanting to be able to become closer friends or become friends with this acquaintance. And I didn't know there was a difference, especially because the gender norms and a girl becoming closer friends with a boy just was like sort of off limits in my like social circles. It just didn't seem to happen very often in school. It was like girls had friends with girls, boys were with boys. And even though we were all in the same class together and like he might sit like really close to me in some classes, I didn't really have conversations with him at lunch or anything. I picked out a boy that I thought maybe, I have a crush on him. And I was like, this guy in my class. And really what I wanted was to become closer friends with him. Really, it was more like what we call a squish in the community. But I didn't know that at the time. I basically thought I might have had a crush on him. I didn't really realize that crushes were like different and had different kinds of feelings involved than just wanting to like get to know the person a bit better and like wishing you could like talk to them more and like feeling excited that you have something in common because you're both reading the same books. Like, to me, that's what I thought maybe a crush was. And I guess I just didn't have a crush when a lot of 10-year-olds are already starting to have a crush. And as I got older, I still did not have a crush. All my crushes, even as I got older, ended up feeling a lot like that. So throughout middle school, of course, I didn't really feel different or broken at all. I felt like, other people were weird or the outliers if they were like particularly interested in like sexual topics or in dating or in romance. And in general, I thought, I was normal. It eventually very slowly crept up on me that I might be becoming like a social failure, and I'll get to that later in this video. But at the very beginning of it all, I really didn't feel that way. I felt very normal. I didn't even suspect that I was different. So, I never understood putting posters of attractive celebrities up on your wall or like kids in middle school asking you who your favorite member of the boy band was, and everyone else was choosing based on how the guy looked. And I was like, what? This is music. I don't even know what they look like. Who's looked that up? Like, who cares, right? Like, why would you care? Like, it's like that kind of stuff was kind of an early sign that I look back on and I'm like, oh, okay, I see why people cared and I didn't. And I was also completely shocked when I realized that 2 of my classmates in middle school were like dating. And I was like, what? Dating? And they were like holding hands in the hallway or something. And I was like, aren't we way too young? What in the world is this? It doesn't even like, this seemed really, it made me really uncomfortable to like see that kids my age were like starting to date. I was like, this doesn't compute at all. So this is also around the time that I started watching like primetime TV shows and shows with really conventionally attractive actors in them. Like adult men that they assume all girls and women are going to have crushes on. And I was trying to figure out what my type was. And it's confusing because I am really drawn to some of these male characters for reasons of like the character's personality, that has how it's written and how well the actors portray them, their acting skills. And it's kind of like having a squish again, but it's like the difference between a crush and especially a crush based on like physical characteristics and just happening to have feelings that are strong for reasons that aren't based on what they look like, to people that are very conventionally considered attractive, and people assume that what they look like does have something to do with it. It's like that part was really, I didn't really understand it at the time, but some part of me knew it was like overly hard to decide like what my preference was. And by the way, when I was like trying to figure out who my type was, it's a very simplistic understanding that I had of like people are drawn more towards dark hair or light hair kind of stuff. It was very much like, which ones do I tend to always like the most? Like, and it's like, I was trying to find a pattern, and it wasn't the right pattern to be looking for in my case. Oh, and like a side note, I used to call these types of people objectively attractive, and over time I learned like that's not really necessarily true. Even though they make lists like sexiest man alive, that's not actually like, that's more like popular vote or like mainstream pop culture, societal beauty standards. Conventionally attractive is a better way to phrase that, because they aren't really objectively attractive. Beauty is really in the eye of the beholder, and not everyone agrees who's the most attractive person, and there is no objective measure for these things. So moving on into my high school years, I mean, I don't know exactly when in the timeline this stuff fits, where I started getting vague notions about like I knew that gay people existed. I don't think I really knew very deeply that bi people existed. And my understanding of what it even means to be gay was very limited probably. But like, I was learning this from like Will and Grace on TV and Friends, where Ross's ex-wife is a lesbian and stuff like that I was starting to watch. And I knew bi people existed enough that when I was 15 years old in high school, I started to actually wonder if I might be bi, because some part of me realized that I had equally like felt drawn to becoming closer friends with like a female friend of mine as I did with like the guy I had a crush on. And then I dismissed it because I thought, if you really had same-sex attraction, you must want to see them naked or really, really want to be kissing them, and you can't stop fantasizing about it. I thought it's like an undeniably strong feeling, and I must not have same-sex attraction. Didn't really let myself think about how I didn't feel those things for guys either. It was like kind of like there was no... It didn't translate to the fact that I didn't feel it for the opposite gender either. And I just assumed I was straight by default. It's like, unless I have same gender attraction, I must be straight. And I guess on top of all of that, I did kind of believe some really incorrect norms. Like I was only vaguely aware of really allosexuality at all, of heterosexuality and what that really meant for women. I mistakenly assumed that most women were like demisexual. I didn't know the word demisexual, but I assumed like they needed to fall in love before they really felt sexual attraction, and that it was like normal to not really feel those types of sexual feelings for strangers or people they didn't really have a close connection with already. I grew up in a town where people were not talking that much about what they actually felt in terms of sexual attraction or sexual desire, and it was pretty taboo for people to be open about their feelings. So I was really just guessing and assuming and basing things off of not necessarily how things really were in reality as well. So I was comparing myself to maybe a fake norm, right? Comparing myself to some kind of norm that wasn't actually really the norm. I just wanted to pause briefly and remind you to subscribe if you're interested in making sure to see more of my videos, and especially if you're interested in more of this personal story about my journey, because I'm going to have, as probably my next video or one of my next videos, a video all about the story of my first kiss and my first date, and that's not in the scope of this video. And if you really want to make sure you catch that video or any other video for me in the future, just hit that little subscribe button. Thanks. So going back into my high school experience, some part of me certainly was confused. I mean, I knew that it didn't make sense to me based on what I was feeling that teenagers were actually so tempted to have sex in high school, the way that the sex ed classes were designed. I mean, I went to a school that had abstinence-plus type of sex ed, which meant they heavily promoted abstinence, although they taught you a little bit of extra stuff. And the way these abstinence-focused sex ed programs go is they imply that obviously you deep down really, really want to have sex, and they try to convince you not to have sex. They assume by default all teenagers have raging hormones and have a ton of interest in having sex. So I already could tell that it's not that hard for me to fight any of these urges because I don't have any of those. So what urges there's people talking about? So some part of me knew that like something wasn't adding up, but I mean, at the same time, it was mostly not on my mind that much. I didn't really feel that different. I thought maybe they were exaggerating or, I don't know what I really thought. It didn't compute to me that I would ever want to have sex while I was in high school. It was easy to follow that guidance of, be careful and try not to have sex. Like, okay. I mean, I also wasn't dating anyone. But then the other thing that happened for me is that I started getting into like fandom communities a little bit around age 16. And that was a little bit past like the end of your sex ed days, which I think for me ended when I was like maybe 15, like ninth grade. I don't know if it was 14, 15. And when I was like entering into fandom communities, the way I entered mostly was YouTube, which had just been invented, and fan videos. I was becoming immersed in vidding culture. And fan videos are often like clips from TV shows matched to music to match the lyrics of the song. And a lot of the fandom subcultures is around shipping. And so a lot of the videos are around the romantic relationships or the two characters you wish were dating or who are actually dating on a show. And I knew people were always saying that like Disney romances are unrealistic, or even all TV show romances are really unrealistic. That in movies and television, there's all this stuff that's like idealized and not quite really how it is in reality. But I was watching videos and starting to create my own videos where it was really like very possible to take very specific lyrics from popular songs on the radio and match them to these other TV shows. And like everything's lining up so well. Some part of me knew that something that was being described must be very real, because why were so many different songs and TV shows and other works of fiction all capturing the exact same story, basically? Like, it didn't make sense that it was all fake. It didn't make sense that this isn't actually reality at all. Obviously, people in real life do date and get married eventually. There is some, like, actual thing going on. All these TV shows that portray casual sex or something, which were popular in the sitcoms that featured like 20-something adults that I was watching, this was based on some kind of actual thing that happens in reality, even if it's slightly different than reality. And some part of me, I think, starting around that age that I was getting into fandom, getting really deeply invested into television, and even just more deeply really invested in musical lyrics, I was getting super curious to understand just what normal people experience when it comes to sex and romance. And some part of me was just desperate to know. Some part of me fundamentally knew I didn't get it. And it felt really important to get it. It felt like, this is such an important thing for people to understand. So moving on to my college days, when I was 18 years old, I went off to this university, and as I was getting to know people, I felt uncomfortable with the thought that they might assume I was more experienced in dating than I was. Like, not only was I a virgin, I'd never even been on a date, I've never been kissed, definitely didn't have any experience having had a boyfriend, and I was meeting girls that did have boyfriends who were like my roommates, and I just felt very like I identified with the inexperience, with being inexperienced, and I didn't really understand why, but like it felt important to me in order for them to know who I really was and like really be seeing me, like the authentic version of me. If they thought I was like an allosexual person or an alloromantic person, someone dating normatively, that they weren't actually seeing something that felt like it resonated with who I was. So, like, I didn't know what I was doing or at all, that I wasn't straight, but some part of me was, like, kind of trying to be, like, I'm not actually that allo, by, like, making a fairly important point of, like, even though I felt embarrassed about it, it was important that they know that this was, like, who I was. And in college, I was also watching the second thing I'd seen Milo Ventimiglia in. And after I'd seen this actor, a very attractive male actor, Milo Ventimiglia, in 2 TV shows, Gilmore Girls and Heroes, I started like wanting to see every single thing he'd done. And I was becoming a big fan of him as an actor. And then a little bit later into college, I became just as obsessed with Kristen Bell. And some part of me started to question if I might be bi again, because I felt like it was a really equally, the obsession I had wasn't really different based on gender, and most of the people I was surrounded by in fandom spaces, it was pretty different. A lot of their obsession with an actor was like motivated by sexual attraction, and I was like, this is weird that I feel so similarly for both of these, but at the same time I didn't really feel like I was bisexual because I didn't really feel like the way I was drawn to, well, either of them was sexual, and it wasn't. And there was no sexual component to my, fandom passion for consuming the works that these actors had created. I just was a big fan of each one of them. I enjoyed their personalities and I enjoyed their skills, and I did a little bit maybe enjoy how like aesthetically attractive they were, how pretty they were. I think it was more like aesthetic appreciation for at least the Milo Ventimiglia side of things. Generally these days, I consider myself to not even have aesthetic attraction towards men, but maybe I have a tiny bit of aesthetic attraction towards very feminine presenting women. So like it's not that often, but sometimes someone is so pretty and I feel like something that kind of feels like aesthetic attraction, and it's always like a straight woman, it seems like. So, I mean, we can talk about that in a later video. But I questioned if I was bi again. And that was like one night on college when I was like, I guess it was coming up to the surface again that I didn't really feel straight, but I still didn't really feel like I had answers either. So I started reading fan fiction age 20. And even writing some of my own fan fiction age 20, and, kind of ironically, my very first fanfic was very Gen. It was about a family relationship. Gen is a term in fanfic spaces for, like, platonic, basically. I mean, it can mean a few things, but means non-romantic. The story doesn't have one romantic ship. But back to the point, I was reading fan fiction, and in fan fiction spaces, wow, I was, age 20, being inundated with the fact that, people are writing like sexually explicit fantasies into these fics about these characters I love, and this is what, women who are sexually attracted to men tend to write about when they write heterosexual relationships. This is what sex really means to them, and what they're actually like fantasizing about was like really fascinating to me because it was so foreign. I was like, what? People think these things and want these things, and there's something like, it was kind of making me uncomfortable, which makes sense because I'm sex averse, asexual. That's how I identify these days. But, it was hard to read a lot of it, but it wasn't as hard then because I was so curious to understand, because it was so academic and detached from actually me realizing I was so different quite yet. While I was still learning about, this is what people think and feel, it was just like, it was kind of a little more neutral for me. And it was just, it was described in explicit detail in some of these, explicit R-rated type fics. And I was just really curious to learn and understand this world that I was really not a part of. And I also just was starting to feel like more and more out of place. Meanwhile, I was like consuming content from the sex positive political movement and community, especially the places where it overlapped with atheist community stuff. I was figuring out I was an atheist right around age 20. It was like end of being 19, start of being 20. And spending time in atheist spaces, there was a lot of discussion of like religion having caused repressed sexuality, but that deep down, like everyone has these feelings. And every time they said everyone, I was like feeling more and more a little bit like maybe I am defective in some way. Like maybe I am not normal if literally everyone masturbates. And if you're not, you're lying. And I'm like, what? Is that true? Really? I don't masturbate, and I don't know why I don't. And it was kind of this thing where I have no sex drive, and that's part of my asexuality. It is not part of everyone's. We can go into that in another video. But in general, it's just like I had a lot of experiences starting to add up in college. I don't have a sex drive, but the more I heard that it was like the saddest thing ever for women to not know how to pleasure themselves, the more I just was really unsure where I fit into all of that. I would later, in the end, learn low or non-existent libido is actually one potential manifestation of the ace experience. Approximately 1/5 of aces rate their sex drive as 0, and over half rate it as very low or 0. In 2011, at age 21, I learned from someone on Twitter that you could describe people as asexual. She was casually mentioning having asexual friends, and I was very intrigued and asked her about it. She linked me to the frequently asked questions page on the Avon wiki. Back then, Avon was one of the only places and one of the main places anyone ever went to for knowledge about asexuality. It was the Asexuality, Visibility, and Education Network. I started reading that Avon page, and it was confusing for me because on the one hand, I think parts of it were resonating, but on the other hand, I didn't understand what they meant. They were talking about people who don't feel sexual attraction or don't feel sexual desire, and I didn't know if I felt it or not. I had been assuming I was normal. So I assumed that, yeah, I don't really feel it yet, but I will, and I'm normal. I think it resonated strongly, but my cognitive dissonance was also like really strong. So what I mean by that is like I couldn't even really let myself think about the fact that it was resonating because I really just didn't want to not be normal. I was afraid of what this would mean if it resonated. Could I really be this sexual orientation that no one has heard of? Could this orientation I'm reading about really be real? Like, I didn't really want to buy that asexuality existed. I was like, I had never heard anything at all about it in my entire life, and I'm 21 years old. And I knew about gay people. I even knew about trans people, but I didn't even see it coming. I'd asked about the asexuality for the person who said, I have asexual friends. And part of me was like, I needed to know. Like, I knew when I read that word, I was like, that seems important. But like, once I saw the answers, I didn't want the answers. I was like, no, but I'm just this inexperienced straight girl. Once I fall in love the first time, I'll totally feel all the things, right? And so, yeah, I was like 90% like in denial and thinking, it wasn't in a big rush to figure this out because I'm not dating anyway, and like, whatever. But there was this other part of me that was scouring the What is Sexual Attraction page of the Avon forum and reading all the answers where a bunch of ace people would try to figure out what sexual attraction was and describe what they think it is based on talking to their allo friends and family and various like random other sources like works of fiction and whatnot. And all of us are there wondering if we're ace because the definition of ace is not feeling sexual attraction. And we're like, in order to answer that, if we feel it or not, we need to know what is sexual attraction. So we don't know if we don't feel it unless we know what it is. So I was trying to understand by literally even asking some of my heterosexual vidder friends in the fandom community, just messaging them and being like, what does it feel like for you? Do you really feel this way towards these like actors on these TV shows? Do you really, it continuously just did not even compute that they really felt these things I wasn't feeling. And I like had this mental block. Like it was the answer staring me right in the face, but I'm like, I don't think that answer is even a possibility. So I'm looking for something else, anything else to explain why I'm different, but I'm not like this. Like, I don't want to be this. And also, all the while, my senior year of college, when I'm ages 21 and 22, my roommate was a lesbian, and she's also a psychology major. And she, was making me think about sexuality a little bit more, because being around a person who's also not sexually attracted to men is making me think about, like, how different or the same I really feel. And she asked me to complete this psychological survey where I had to answer this whole page of like deep questions about my sexual preferences and desires and fantasies. And I was like, what? Blinking at it, completely like, I mean, that by that point, I was extra like starting to realize doing something like this questionnaire is making me feel like maybe I really am asexual. I still didn't want it to be true and was waiting to prove to myself that I wasn't by trying dating, and I like couldn't let myself decide I was ace until I tried dating. But trying to answer that survey and having so much trouble coming up with any answers because you weren't really allowed to say you had none, I think was the problem. And it was like none of them felt right. Seeing a questionnaire like that, I think really just put into perspective for me that I wasn't normal. That was actually it was just this like casual thing helping out my roommate, but it was so hard to try to answer and not just say none for everything. And I knew that you weren't supposed to be saying none for everything. It was like obvious by how they phrased it that they didn't expect anyone taking it to be asexual or to say not applicable to like every single sexual question about what you want. It also crossed my mind at some point that I like never had been motivated to learn how to put on makeup, and I wondered if maybe it was because I wasn't actually straight, and most girls seem to be motivated to do the makeup thing because they're desiring the attention of boys. I wasn't really sure, but there was definitely some part of me that felt like that was going on as well. It just kind of snuck up on me. I didn't consciously choose not to do it. I just missed the boat. Like everyone else was like, it was a big priority, and I was like, what? Oh, I feel behind on life. And I also don't feel super motivated, like I have to look better than I already do without makeup. So I turned 22 in January of 2012 and then graduated in May 2012. And I was still 22 years old when I finally went on my first date. I was mostly motivated to start dating because I felt like a social failure. Not because of intrinsic deep longing to kiss a guy or hold hands with him, or pent-up sexual desire, or anything quite like that. I was still trying to, like, assume I was straight by default, but it was getting harder and harder, and I think I needed to, like, prove to myself that I was really straight, because some part of me was questioning the asexuality thing pretty hard by then. I really did believe that women needed to fall in love before they'd feel the feelings that were sexual, and I just needed experience, and then I'd be straight, and it would all be a relief, and everything would be fine. That's sort of what I was thinking. I was feeling like it would only be okay if I was straight, and I need to not be a social failure by having graduated college and still never been on a date, never been kissed, that I'm way behind my peers. So that's the context of me starting to choose to date and go on dating apps. If you appreciated this video and got something out of hearing this stage of my story, please leave me a comment and let me know, or just hit the like button. If you want to hear that whole story of me starting dating straight men at age 22 in 2012, please check out my next video, which is going to be linked right here on the screen or somewhere. I don't know, I'm still new to this. I told you that my first video I'm recording. As soon as it's posted. That's the plan.